Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Whenever we hear the phrase global water crisis, our brains usually jump straight to those dramatic pictures of cracked Earth, empty reservoirs, and devastating climate-driven droughts, right? But putting on my policy expert hat here and looking at the raw data, I have to tell you, that is really only half the story. The true crisis we're facing isn't just about a lack of rain. It's this massive, invisible structural deficit. Ultimately, it's a massive failure of investment and governance. So let's dive into this and uncover what is actually draining our most vital resource.
So here is our roadmap for today's analysis. We're going to cover 1. The escalating water demand, 2. The water investment gap, 3. The 3 pollution typologies, 4. Governance and water mafias, and finally, 5. Bridging the investment gap.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the escalating water demand, a baseline assessment.
Now, you might naturally assume that our water use simply scales up alongside the human population, right? But the data actually tells a much more aggressive story. Between 1950 and 2018, global water use skyrocketed from 1.22 trillion cubic meters to over 4 trillion. To put that in perspective, our global water demand is literally growing at more than twice the rate of population growth, and a huge chunk of that is concentrated in rapidly developing emerging economies.
So what exactly is driving that massive spike? Well, we really have to weigh physical scarcity against anthropogenic, or basically human-driven demand. Obviously, physical scarcity is a brutal reality. Climate-driven droughts have degraded a whopping 80% of agricultural soils in sub-Saharan Africa. But our anthropogenic footprint, it is equally staggering. As global wealth goes up, so does our indirect water consumption. Take our shifting diets, for example. A wealthier diet relies heavily on protein, and producing just 1 gram of protein from beef takes 6 times more water than getting it from something like pulses or lentils. Throw in rapid urbanization and a projected 400% jump in manufacturing water demand by 2050, and wow, you start to see the immense, crushing pressure we're putting on the whole system.
Which brings us to Section 2, the water investment gap, the structural deficit. Okay, this right here is the absolute core of our explainer today, the water investment gap. Honestly, as a policy analyst, this is the structural bottleneck that keeps me up at night. Basically, it's the pervasive, ongoing struggle that countries face when trying to get the capital together to either fix old leaky pipes or build vital new treatment plants. And why is it so hard? Well, mostly because, on a global scale, we still tend to view water almost exclusively as this endless, free social and environmental right, rather than what it actually is, a highly valuable, capital-intensive economic asset that desperately needs funded, ongoing maintenance. And because of that gap, the fallout is just massive. Get this, a staggering 80% of the world's wastewater is discharged straight back into natural ecosystems without a single drop of treatment. Nothing. So not only are we actively poisoning our own shallow aquifers and rivers, but the breakdown of all that untreated sludge actually generates around 5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge missed opportunity, right? Because with the proper infrastructure, we could literally capture that wastewater and turn it into a fantastic source of clean energy.
Let's look closer at that fallout in Section 3, the 3 pollution typologies, externalities of an action.
So back in 2019, the World Bank categorized this invisible crisis into 3 distinct typologies, which is super helpful because it shows how a country's economic stage completely dictates its specific pollution problems. First up, we have the pollutants of poverty in low-income countries. This is largely driven by raw, untreated sewage caused by a total lack of infrastructure. Second, you've got the pollutants of growing prosperity, which are heavily tied to agriculture and industrialization. Think about the insane 700% spike in nitrogen fertilizer use we've seen in Asia since 1960. And finally, there are emerging pollutants in high-income nations. This is where aging infrastructure just struggles to filter out complex modern contaminants, things like microplastics and pharmaceutical residues.
When you map all of this out, it paints a truly borderless picture, high-risk zones for poor water quality. When you factor in things like biological oxygen demand, salinity, and nitrogen levels, prove that this creeping threat really doesn't care about national boundaries. It's destroying downstream ecosystems, stifling economic progress, and creating a massive public health nightmare. And it's an invisible crisis precisely because we often can't even see these chemical imbalances with the naked eye until the systemic damage is already done.
Moving right along to Section 4, Governance and Water Mafias, the Institutional Vacuum. Now think about what happens when a city explodes in population. Formal municipal networks usually just fail to keep pace, which leaves huge, sprawling, informal settlements totally disconnected from piped water. This creates a severe governance vacuum. And, well, if you know anything about public policy, you know a vacuum never stays empty for long. it gets quickly hijacked by unregulated private cartels, what people often call water tanker mafias. These syndicates step in and basically extort the poorest citizens, charging exorbitant rates for trucked-in water that is often really questionable in quality. It is a textbook, tragic example of how structural poverty plus an infrastructure deficit equals a highly exploitative informal economy. But hey, this institutional failure doesn't just hit the poorest communities, it impacts the middle and upper classes too, and their workarounds are creating what policy folks call a wicked problem. Let's look at the absolute boom in domestic reverse osmosis water filters in India. Because people just do not trust the public tap water, individual households are installing these energy-hungry purifiers. But the math on this is actually wild. To get just 5 liters of clean drinking water, these systems can waste up to 100 liters of water, spitting it out as this highly concentrated, dirty brine. When millions of households are doing this in a region where water is already scarce, you have a private solution that is literally supercharging a public environmental disaster.
All right, so how do we actually fix this? Section 5, Bridging the Investment Gap, the Policy Playbook.
The World Bank has laid out a really clear 3-step ladder of policy interventions to tackle this whole shebang. Step 1 is information disclosure. That means publishing transparent water quality data to empower citizens and spark some real social action. Step 2 is prevention, because, let's be real, stopping pollution from hitting a waterway in the first place is always going to be cheaper and more effective than trying to extract it later. And finally, Step 3 is targeted investments and treatment. This means we can't just throw public tax dollars into a black hole of bad projects. We have to use strict incentive structures to monitor actual performance and reward real results.
But to actually finance all of this, we need a massive structural shakeup in how we govern water. We really have to ditch this outdated assumption that treating wastewater is solely the government's burden. We need smart incentives to pull in private capital. We also need to start slapping tariffs directly on corporate and industrial polluters, basically making them pay for the cleanup. At the same time, we absolutely have to protect vulnerable citizens with income-based lifeline tariffs, ensuring that access to basic human rights is still met. And on the city level, utilities have got to upgrade their aging networks to stop huge physical distribution leaks. In the policy world, we call this non-revenue water, which is just a fancy term for water that literally leaks out of the pipes before it can even be billed to a customer.
And look, massive centralized systems cannot do this all on their own. The data is crystal clear. Modern utilities have got to embrace decentralized governance. They need to empower local, community-based models. A brilliant example of this is the indigenous Subak system in Bali, which has been sustainably managing water distribution for literal centuries. By blending those deep local community frameworks with modern technology, we can make sure our infrastructure operates in harmony with local cultural values and, most importantly, stays within strict ecological carrying capacities. I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on today. As our global populations boom, our diets get more water-intensive, and our economies industrialize at warp speed, our thirst for water is vastly outstripping the infrastructure we have in place. We really have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, can we honestly afford to keep treating water like it's just this infinite, free social good? Or is it finally time we completely rewire our policies to value, protect, and invest in it like the absolutely critical, priced economic asset that it truly is? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the tough questions about the invisible structures holding up the resources we rely on every single day.